Hello, good afternoon, good morning, and thank you to you for joining us today. We're going to be speaking about our environmental risk outlook for 2020. My name is Stacey Gilfillan, and I'm a managing consultant here at Verisk Maplecroft, and I'll be moderating the webinar today from the UK. Before we begin, I'll provide a quick intro to Maplecroft and provide a little bit of housekeeping before handing things over to my colleagues. We'll try to keep this webinar to about 30 minutes. For those of you who may not know us, here at Maplecroft, we believe in simplifying the complexities of managing risk. By combining our world-leading data with expert analysis and advice, we equip our clients with the necessary insight to make more effective decisions and target resources where needed most. Now, I'd like to make you aware of a few housekeeping items. Firstly, your microphone is muted by default for the duration of the webinar. However, you can use the chat panel to send us questions at any time during the presentation. If you are viewing the webinar in the full screen mode, you can see the chat function via the drop-down panel that is revealed when your mouse is at the top of your screen. Otherwise, it can be opened at the top right of your WebEx window or by clicking the blue dialog button. Please note that if you would like to ask questions anonymously, you must have host and presenter selected in the drop-down box of recipients for sending your question. Otherwise, the other participants will see the question and who it's from. Second, we will try to answer as many questions as possible with the time remaining at the end of the presentation. But if we run out of time and we did not get to your question, we will coordinate a follow-up response with you after the session. And finally, the presentation slides and recording of the webinar will be made available to you via email in the next few days. Just to note that due to the GDPR regulation, if you selected Do Not Email on any Maplecroft form, unfortunately, we will not be able to send you the slides from today's presentation. You can change this in your settings, or you can get in touch with us directly at info, at maplecroft.com if you'd like to receive those slides in the recording. That's the end of the housekeeping. I'm now delighted to be able to introduce today's panelists, Dr. Richard Houston, Head of Strategy for Environment and Climate Change. He's based in our Bath office here in the UK, and Will Nichols, Head of Environment.
Absolutely. Thanks, Stacey, and apologies, you were a little in and out there. So the ERO is our pick of the environment and climate issues that we think at Maplecroft are what's going to come into sharp focus this year, and that's across a range of sectors. So we've come to these topics by talking to not only our clients, but sort of wider business community, as well as through our own analysis of environmental trends and the kind of world around us. So next week, we'll look at how the rise of populism is driving a wave of environmental regulatory rollbacks, how that's contributing to a spike in climate protests and litigation, and of course, what all that means for companies. But today, we're going to focus on sea level rise. We're going to look at scenario analysis as part of climate disclosure, and we'll also touch on why deforestation risk should be front of mind in 2020.
Okay, well, that's definitely a lot to unpack, so let's dive right in. I guess we can start with sea level rise. It seems like a longer term issue. Why should companies be worrying about that?
Sorry, Stacey, I'm struggling to hear you there, so I'm just gonna crack on. So I guess people might be wondering why sea level rise, we're talking about that when it could be a kind of longer term issue. You know, why should companies be worrying about it this year? And I think that's kind of a good question. You know, especially when people are extremely and understandably focused on a very imminent threat for the next couple of months. And you know, sea level rise is, of course, seen as a slow-moving issue, you know, something that we won't have to worry about until closer to the end of the century, which is, you know, when most of the projections around sea level rise are really given to. But, you know, even just today, we saw reports that global sea levels rose around 2 millimeters in 2 months after last year's warm summer melted something like 600 billion tons of ice in Greenland. And, you know, while seasonal shifts will happen, we know that the IPCC is saying that, you know, sea level rise, the rates of sea level rise are accelerating. So effectively, the height of the ocean is increasing faster than has been projected. And you know, unless global emissions start to show signs of declining, you know, this trend is going to continue. We're going to see these rates get faster. And this brings two main problems, I guess. So the first would be that current projects being built may not be able to withstand the seas for as long as they envisage to do so. So if you're building a seawall that's meant to withstand a certain level of sea level rise, and we're finding that sea level rise is actually going faster than we think, you could be spending a lot of money for something that isn't all.
Will, I think we might have lost you. I think, Jeff, can you hear me okay? And Rich, can you hear me? Because maybe we can have Rich, if you can just cover the rest of the points that I think Will's trying to make on this slide.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess ultimately the point is, while sea level rise, yes, it may be a slow-moving topic, and it will have implications for investments with such as infrastructure over 40, 50, 60-year time periods. I mean, I think I would argue that, even investments over a time period of about 30 years, you're looking at the fact that you've got these accelerating global sea levels alongside this upward trend in emissions, that this is going to be a real issue for investments across the board. Will, are you back on at this stage?
I don't know. Can anyone hear me?
Yes.
People hear me?
Oh,
fantastic. Okay. Apologies for the threat there. I wasn't quite sure how far I got to. I was talking about sort of why the sea level rise is getting, we worry about sea level rise accelerating. And, as Rich said, it really brings kind of closer to the present day, the time when we will expect to see these kind of impacts, of flooding, of amplifying storms, kind of pressure on infrastructure as well. So, as Rich mentioned, that means that if we are looking at investments for projects that are going to be around in, 40, 50, even potentially 30, as Rich mentioned, years, things like power plants, airports, data centers, we really need to start factoring sea level rise impacts into that kind of decision making as soon as we can.
Right, but sea level rise isn't expected to be uniform. So are there any particular areas or regions where companies need to be focusing their efforts?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a fair amount of variation between forecasts for global sea level rise and local sea level rise, and companies as well as governments and municipalities really need to be aware of this. So for our environmental risk outlook, we use Maplecroft's new sea level rise index to pinpoint which major cities. When we talk about major cities, we're talking about cities with populations of a million or more. Which of those cities are most at risk? And this index combines projections from thousands of points around the globe with a digital terrain module to simulate how far seawater would sort of inundate land, assuming there aren't any mitigation measures in place. So the two areas that really popped for us were Guangzhou and Dongguan, which are two major cities in China's Pearl River Delta economic zone. These are by far the most exposed and potentially face being under as much as 67 centimeters of water by 2100, and possibly as much as 2 meters if mitigation measures aren't put in place. And of course, obviously, this is severely disruptive for businesses in that city and people in that city. But it really has consequences for supply chains across the globe. That this area, the Pearl River Delta, generates almost 4% of global wealth. It boasts the bulk of China's automotive, petrochemical, electronics powerhouses. Around 20% of the world's smartphones are produced here. And so while there are roughly 3,000 kilometers of sea defenses in the area, just a 30 centimeter rise in global sea level, which is, sort of half of what we're potentially projecting, would overwhelm many of them. Now, we'd expect China as a country to be better able to cope with the worst effects of sea level rise. It's a wealthy nation. It's got a certain government structure that means it can build large-scale projects with very little opposition. But as you can see from this map, China is by far from the only place at risk. I mean, there are a host of Asian economic centers at high or extreme risk. And in fact, our our work identified that 11 of the 15 most at-risk cities are in Asia, and that includes centers like Tokyo, like Jakarta, Shanghai, Kolkata. So the real risk here for companies is I guess, whether they can, obviously there's kind of immediate disruption risk, but whether they can rely on the national or municipal governments in especially poorer nations, so perhaps India, perhaps Indonesia, Vietnam, whether they can rely on those to build the measures needed to defend their factory, as well as all the sort of supporting infrastructure around it, or whether they, as a company, are going to have to make significant investments in their own kind of measures. And then you also have the sort of negative multiplier, whereby cities and countries get labeled as high-risk areas. It affects their credit rating. It makes it much more difficult for them to attract investment. And that really amplifies this effect that we see, where poorer nations really get hit by the brunt of climate change.
Yeah, I know we're seeing a lot of that. So I guess turning to you, Rich, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what companies can do to mitigate the risks of sea level rise.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess Will's highlighted the fact that there's this tremendous economic risk. I've seen some estimates that sea level rise could result in excess of $100 trillion by 2050. I think probably what we're seeing now is that organizations, governments, companies are beginning to wake up to the fact that we're going to need a significant investment to deal with this threat. We know, from our clients that there are a few companies out there that are proactively assessing the risk posed by sea level rise. And one of the first places that they typically start is using the data and the projections that Will's just highlighted. Really what they're trying to do is understand where assets or operations or supply chains, where they're most at risk. So understanding where those areas are then allows them to prioritize risk management actions. And a lot of companies are beginning to look at tools like scenario analysis to assess this, as well as other climate-related risks, really stress test their strategies against those risks.
Right, yeah, I understand that technique, that scenario analysis, has been utilized by the security industry for a long time, but is that a technique that a lot of companies are using at the moment?
Well, it's probably fair to say that it's not an approach that's widely adopted, not yet anyway. Investors are really keen for companies to use it and disclose their results. But I'd say there are a few companies, but on the whole, it's probably lagging. But I certainly think at Maplecroft, at least, we expect this to change in 2020 and in future years. And that's because this scenario analysis as a tool is a key element of the recommendations of the TCFD, or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. And essentially, the TCFD recommendations are a framework for how companies can identify and disclose climate risks, both physical risks like sea level rise that we've just been discussing, as well as the risks associated with a transition to a low carbon economy. And when we're thinking about physical risks, we're talking about things, we're talking about acute risks like more frequent and powerful storms. And we're also thinking about chronic risks like sea level rise and long-term shifts in temperature, for example. And the aim of the TCFD framework is to really ensure that investors are provided with decision useful information. And ultimately, the goal is to ensure that climate risk is baked into every financial decision that's being taken. Over the last 2 or 3 years or so, we've seen organizations increasingly align their approach to thinking about climate risk, and that certainly their reporting, with the TCFD recommendations. Primarily that's been in the financial sector, but we're increasingly seeing that spreading into their investee companies, for example, and corporates are beginning to follow this trend and really embark on their own TCFD journey. But what you can certainly see on this slide is that across the board, both investors and corporates are certainly lagging behind on the scenario analysis element. And this is becoming, especially for corporates, this is becoming quite a pain point, because there is so much emphasis being placed on on scenario analysis by investors. And there's probably a couple of reasons why scenario analysis is challenging and why the uptake has been so slow. The first is that, I mean, it's outright difficult. The TCFDs essentially ask companies to describe the impact of climate change under a range of different scenarios, the impact on their business, their strategy, and their financial planning. So there's a number of challenges around which scenarios you choose, how you then translate that into financial impacts, and how you integrate the results into strategic decision-making planning. And these results can, at times, if you're uncomfortable with the process, these results can often feel a bit uncomfortable. They can feel almost like guesswork. And I guess the second main challenge is one that we're hearing a lot, certainly from our clients, that there is this growing reporting burden. They're being asked to report against a whole host of different standards and benchmarks. And that's obviously eating up valuable time and resources.
Yeah, I guess that's a valid question. So, Will, why should companies be investing time aligning their disclosures to TCFDs ahead of these other standards?
Yeah, it is a good question, and we know our clients are kind of facing sort of pushback from executives who are wondering why they're spending a lot of time and resources on this. I think really simply put, it's going to affect your bottom line if you're not able to answer the questions that investors are posing. Your kind of financial credibility is under threat a little bit. It's probably a little bit too soon to say that investability or creditworthiness sort of hinge on perfect TCFD disclosures. But we do know that rating agencies, for example, are already using climate disclosures and strategies as a sort of window into wider corporate governance. So, last year Moody's reconsidered Exxon's AAA rating, alongside that of other countries, which, to me, that's kind of a clear steer that the kind of scale of a company's efforts to meet its global carbon targets and fit it within the sort of global push to tackle climate change can start to impact its creditworthiness. And this risk is not just fossil fuel companies; it really impacts those companies as well that might facilitate companies that also emit a lot of carbon. So you can see here from the graphic we've got on the screen, Moody's have identified 11 sectors that have a combined 2.2 trillion in rated debt that were really at risk of carbon-related downgrades. Obviously, you have kind of oil and gas, you've got mining, but you've also got automotive, you've got transportation, you've got shipping. All of these sectors that are kind of linked into the global fossil fuel supply chain are at risk of this as well. And as our kind of data highlights there, all of those sectors are sort of higher extreme risk for emissions in the US. And then I guess, aside from the financial risk, there's also the real threat of TCFD-aligned disclosures becoming mandatory. We have Mark Carney there, the former governor of the Bank of England. He warned that we could potentially see mandatory disclosures in line with TCFDs almost as soon as 2021. And we've already seen New Zealand consult on a mandatory regime, and the UK, Australia, Canada, France, Japan, and even, of course, the EU, they're not far behind on this. And, of course, then you've got to add to the fact that, all signatories to the UN's Principles for Responsible Investment will need to disclose for TCFD standards from this year. So I think the kind of direction for companies is really pretty clear.
Right. So, Rich, I guess you mentioned, that there are a lot of companies that are still lagging behind on TCFD alignment, and that's obviously difficult to do. Can you tell us how companies can make a start? What's the first step?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess it can seem a bit daunting, and I think one of the things that we'd recommend is that the sooner you start, the better, particularly around the scenario analysis piece, because getting that right is going to go a long way to tackling some of the more difficult questions that investors are beginning to ask now, but almost certainly will ask more of in the future. One of the first steps we always recommend to our clients is you've really got to engage with your stakeholders and your investors to understand what information is material to them, what do they want to know, and how are they going to use that information. Another key step is an internal one that you can take, and that's about understanding what processes and governance structures you already have in place. So depending on your industry and the nature of your business, you might actually find that your risk or your finance teams are already using scenario analysis as a tool when they're thinking about other risks. So you can leverage that framework and that knowledge and that experience. In terms of running the scenario analysis, the TCFD recommends that organizations look at a 2-degree scenario and at least one more. So this could be a business as usual scenario, for example, where emissions continue to rise unabated and we'd expect to see much more intense physical risks. Or it could be a scenario that's in line with a particular country's Paris Agreement pledge, where you might see increased climate activism and litigation. But regardless of which scenario you choose, the important thing is to be really, really clear on the parameters that you're using and any assumptions that you're making within that scenario. We've found that, with working with a few companies on this, that a useful approach can be to kind of run a pilot, so maybe do it on a specific asset or a business activity. And this allows certain stakeholders within the business to really get to grips with what a scenario analysis looks like, how it feels, to understand the process, and then you can roll this out across the rest of the company. And I guess the final step is all about how you use the results. So integrating the results of the scenario analysis into planning and strategy. And this can often be done by leveraging or adapting existing management approaches, as I mentioned earlier. The key aspect throughout the process is really using robust and granular data. This not only adds consistency and credibility, but it goes a long way to providing investors with a high level of confidence in what you're, not just your approach, but the output that they'll be using as well. And I guess a final thing that we find that companies also really benefit from is looking at best practice examples. So not just in their industry, but across all industries. And this can really reduce the fear factor and can help turn almost scenario analysis from being another reporting burden into actually quite an effective decision-making tool.
Thanks, Rich. It's really helpful to kind of have that breakdown. I see we've got some questions coming in. Thank you very much. Before we get to those, I do want to cover our final topic, deforestation. Will, can you tell us why forest loss is such a hot topic this year?
Yeah, absolutely, Stacey. And just listening to Rich there, I think there are probably a fair amount of parallels between increasing investor demands for transparency around climate risk and their interest in deforestation as well. Just to roll back slightly, I mean, we're probably all aware of NGO and consumer-led campaigns that have forced companies on the back foot a little bit, forced them to up their ante on performance when it comes to forest loss, and whether that's kind of reducing deforestation in their direct operations or through their supply chains as well. But of course, investors are equally interested in company performance here. Deforestation is a major source of ESG risk, as last year's fires in the Amazon and Australia have really brought home. And after the Amazon, we saw investors with something like 16 trillion assets under management, calling on companies to this open letter to tackle forest loss, calling it a systemic risk to portfolios. But perhaps what's really different about this year is, coronavirus aside, is we should have COP26, which is meant to be when the Paris Agreement really kicks into gear. And that's going to mean a lot of countries that have promised to address their emissions through forestry initiatives are really going to have to come forward with some policies to back those up. We know there's around about 11% of global emissions arising from sort of poor forest and land use management. And looking at the INDCs, which countries submitted ahead of the Paris Agreement, there are about 140 nations that mention forest landscape restoration, of which around about a third include a numerical target to tackle land use change and forests, which is LULUCF, effectively, however you want to pronounce that. And you can see here from the graphic, a number of those 38 countries are really key for commodities like soy, sugar, cocoa, and livestock. All of which are commodities that are likely to be impacted by things like new forest laws. So operators or suppliers in these 38 countries, face the prospect of laws coming in, forest laws coming in, that may have been, rushed or poorly scrutinized if countries are going to try and get them in place or bring them forward in time for the kind of COP26 deadline. And, that's going to have big consequences for businesses. We know businesses like kind of stability, they like things to be predictable. So new laws coming in, especially laws which, may not be all that well scrutinized, it's going to be a real issue. And what's more, the ability of these countries to effectively enforce those laws, even if they do bring them in, is not at all certain. So, in the graphic here, we've taken the 38 countries and we've mapped the deforestation risk along the bottom and our environmental regulatory framework index along the vertical axis. And, what this kind of shows is that 19 of those 38 countries that we identified are higher extreme risk in our deforestation index, which includes those key commodity producing countries that we've mentioned. But of those 19 countries, there are 8, including the DR Congo, which are also high in extreme risk in our environmental regulatory framework index. So they're kind of towards the right of the graphic here. And that means that even if these nations really intended to get to grips with forest loss, their efforts could well be undermined by weak policies, weak structures, and weak institutions.
Thanks, Will. It sounds like it's a real threat of regulatory upheaval and uncertainty for business. Rich, I know you've worked a lot with companies looking to address deforestation risk. Do you have any thoughts on how corporates can face these challenges?
Yeah, sure. I guess we're definitely seeing deforestation rise up the corporate agenda. And one of the first steps that companies need to be able to take is to pinpoint that risk. They can then act on it to limit their exposure. So most of the organizations we work with are typically aware of their impact of their direct operations on forest loss. So the next step there is to track that impact, is to set measurable targets to reduce it, and then to disclose on that progress in the public domain, whether that's against recognized benchmarks or, for example, through their sustainability reports. What this does is it demonstrates to investors, as well as consumers as well, that the company is proactively managing the deforestation issue, and that it's well placed to deal with any of the change in regulation that Will's mentioned. That's kind of the direct operations. Where it becomes trickier is with the supply chain. So we've found that kind of tracing suppliers and their contribution to forest loss becomes incredibly difficult once you go beyond tier 1 suppliers. But one of the best approaches can be, in the absence of this sort of transparent supply chain, is the identification of at-risk commodities in particular sourcing regions. And again, this is the first step in understanding where the risk is and then taking steps to lower that exposure to deforestation.
Great, thanks, Rich. I guess this brings our presentation to the end. We do have a few minutes now to turn to some questions that have come in. Just a few minutes because we did have that technical difficulty in the beginning there. Here's one for Will. You've identified sea level threat in China and Asia, but should we be worried about other parts of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. We should be. Our work here is kind of focused on major cities, but that's absolutely not to say that other regions aren't effective and won't need to make this kind of significant investments that Rich was talking about. So where I am in New York, that's in the top 15 of at-risk cities we've identified. And although here there's, I think, a 10 billion investment in resilience, that's likely to be well short of what's needed. With some estimates think that we could need up to 120 billion by 2100.
And that's actually, it's really interesting you mentioned that figure, Will, of 10 billion for New York, because there's a similar figure being bandied around for London. So the Thames barrier will need replacing effectively by 2070 due to sea level rise. And in order to complete by that date, they need to begin work by sort of mid-century, 2045, 2050. So as part of a wider program, the UK government is looking at a number of different options for hard and soft defences across the Thames estuary, across London. But I know certainly with businesses with a significant presence in London that are actually quite nervous about this because there's been no firm commitment yet. And there's actually a huge economic concentration in London, something like £200 billion worth of property in the Thames tidal floodplain. And also London as an economic engine it contributes something like £250 billion to the UK economy each year.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the sort of, I guess, GDP at risk, which isn't something we've spoken about yet, but was something we took a little bit of a look at in the report at a national level anyway. And in terms of GDP at risk, it's probably no surprise to anyone listening that the Netherlands and China have the most at risk from sea level rise, and it's run about 350 billion each if no mitigation is put in place, which is a fairly small amount of China's GDP total, but for the Netherlands it's a hefty chunk. But there are other countries as well. So Germany, for example, about 1% of its GDP is at risk from sea level rise. If you look at the Middle East, the UAE over 5%, and Norway the same number. So this really is an issue that investors across the globe will need to start looking at.
Okay, thanks, Will and Rich. Will, here's another one for you. You mentioned a number of countries are looking at mandatory TCFDs, but how likely is that really?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I think obviously it's going to depend a lot on the political situation in those individual countries, and things like the spread of coronavirus as well are obviously a bit more kind of up the agenda right now, as is things like Brexit potentially as well. So that could influence how the EU progresses on this. Of course, a victory for Donald Trump in the US elections later this year would probably slow US uptake. But with kind of more and more investors demanding this information, TCFD alignment, might become all but required for companies anyway, a kind of de facto requirement, which makes laws a little less necessary. Although, I would say the kind of ability to stress test your business against kind of future risks is looking at kind of increasingly smart. Now we're seeing the sort of havoc the coronavirus is wreaking on markets and operations.
And I guess, just to jump in here, I'd also add, certainly at the moment, we're seeing companies using TCFD alignment almost as a means to gaining a competitive advantage. So they recognise the trend, and there's certainly in the financial sector we've seen a significant uptake, and that's now driving it through corporates as well. So businesses recognising that trend and not just trying to get out ahead of any impending regulation or legislation that Will mentioned, but that they're simply looking to demonstrate that they're being proactive, they're demonstrating to investors that they're addressing this issue of climate change, and they're trying to differentiate themselves from their peers.
Okay, Rich, there's a question that's come in for you. What sectors do you think are most at risk from the deforestation challenges that you mentioned earlier?
So I guess commodities which typically present a high risk profile are soy, palm oil, cattle, sugarcane. These are all associated with forest loss in different parts of the world. But we probably shouldn't forget about mining as well. It's a huge driver of forest loss, and it's really difficult to keep tabs on illegal and artisanal operations. So I guess to answer your question, companies who are sourcing both the hard and soft commodities need to be extra vigilant to make sure they're well placed to understand and manage any potential damaging regulatory and reputational threats.
Great. Well, thanks, Rich and Will. I think that's probably a good place to stop for today's session. As I mentioned earlier, we'll follow up with the attendees with a copy of the slides and a recording of this webinar. Please do join us next Thursday when we'll be presenting the rest of the ERO topics. You can register at our website at www.maplecroft.com in the News and Events section. That's maplecroft.com. If you'd like to join us next Thursday, please do so. And finally, I'd like to say thank you to Will and Rich for today's discussion, and thank you to everyone who was able to join us today. Thanks.